In the suffocating darkness of Highgate Cemetery, you can feel the cold breath of something ancient and malevolent on your neck. As you wander through the twisted gravestones, a figure lurks in the shadows, its glowing eyes fixed on you, hungry for fear. Do you sense its presence stalking you, drawing closer with each heartbeat? The legend of the Highgate Vampire is no mere tale. It's a chilling reality that could soon become your own nightmare. Can you escape the clutches of the creature that haunts the night, or will you become its next victim? Chapter 1. The legend begins. Nestled on a hill in North London, Highgate Cemetery is a haunting labyrinth of ivy-clad tombs, Gothic arches, and weathered statues, their faces worn by time and the elements. Built in 1839, it quickly became the final resting place for thousands of London's elite, as well as a place of curious fascination for those drawn to its beauty and mystery. Yet beneath its grandeur, a darker tale took shape, a tale that would shake the city to its core in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Highgate Cemetery, long associated with death, began to take on an even more sinister reputation, the resting place of a vampire. As dusk fell over the cemetery, the towering crypts and mausoleums cast long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the ground. The air was always colder there, as if the spirits of the dead lingered in the chilling mist that often hung low over the gravestones. Locals had long whispered of strange happenings, unexplained cold spots, eerie sounds, and a feeling of being watched, but nothing prepared them for what would come next. It began with a sighting. In late 1969, two schoolgirls taking a shortcut through the cemetery reported seeing a tall, dark figure standing motionless among the graves. The figure was cloaked in shadow, its features indistinguishable, but what struck the girls the most was its eyes, glowing red, like embers in the dark. They fled in terror, breathless as they recounted their story to anyone who would listen. Few took them seriously, dismissing it as the product of overactive imaginations or the tricks of moonlight. But the sightings didn't stop. Soon more locals came forward with similar accounts. A man walking his dog along the perimeter of the cemetery at night claimed he saw a figure hovering above the ground, as if defying gravity, its eyes burning into him from the darkness. Another witness, a woman living near the cemetery, awoke one night to find a shadowy figure outside her bedroom window, despite her home being on the second floor. She swore that the figure's glowing eyes pierced through her as it vanished into the night without a sound. These strange occurrences might have been dismissed as urban legends, but the number of witnesses grew, and their stories were disturbingly consistent. Reports flooded in of a malevolent presence within the cemetery, an overwhelming sense of dread, inexplicable cold spots, and the appearance of a tall, cloaked figure with eyes that burned like coals. Locals began avoiding the cemetery, especially after dark. The few who dared enter often left terrified, convinced they had encountered something otherworldly. The local newspapers caught wind of the sightings in early 1970. The Hampstead and Highgate Express published the first report, a tantalizing headline: "The Ghost of Highgate Cemetery?" The article detailed accounts of the mysterious figure and included witness testimony from frightened locals. Some claimed to have seen the figure vanish before their eyes. Others described strange, animal-like corpses found near the cemetery, drained of blood, as if by some predatory creature. The press, always hungry for a sensational story, seized upon the idea that something dark and supernatural had taken residence in the cemetery. Speculation ran wild. Was it a ghost, a demon, or something far worse? As more reports surfaced, the story of the Highgate Vampire began to take shape. Eyewitnesses now described the figure not only as a spectral presence, but as a physical being, one that could pass through walls, vanish at will, and yet leave behind tangible evidence of its presence. The most chilling accounts came from those who ventured into the cemetery after dark, seeking answers or thrills. One such witness, Tony Hill, a local resident, recounted his harrowing experience to the press in early 1970. "I had heard the stories, but I didn't believe them," Hill told reporters. "I thought it was just people getting carried away. So I went there one night with a couple of friends just to see for myself. We were walking along one of the paths when suddenly it felt like the air turned to ice. There was this overwhelming feeling of dread, like something was watching us. We looked around, and there it was standing between two tombstones. It was tall, much taller than any person, and its eyes. God, its eyes were glowing red. We ran as fast as we could. I've never been so scared in my life. Hill's account, and others like it, fanned the flames of public hysteria. The cemetery, once a place of peace and reflection, became a site of morbid fascination. Crowds began to gather outside its gates at night, hoping to catch a glimpse of the infamous vampire. Some came armed with crosses and garlic, ready to confront the creature, while others came merely to witness the spectacle. As public interest surged, so did the intensity of the reports. Stories of strange occurrences multiplied. Animals found mutilated, their blood drained. Gravestones cracked and broken, as if something had crawled out from beneath the earth. And, most disturbingly, sightings of the shadowy figure wandering not just within the cemetery, but in the surrounding neighborhoods. The creature, it seemed, was not confined to the cemetery's gates. With the media frenzy growing, paranormal investigators, occultists, and curious thrill-seekers descended on Highgate Cemetery, each eager to uncover the truth behind the sightings. Among them were two men whose rivalry would soon become as infamous as the vampire itself, David Farrant and Sean Manchester. Each claimed to have knowledge of the occult and vowed to rid the cemetery of the dark entity, though their methods and motivations would soon diverge in dramatic fashion. But in the early days of the vampire scare, before the hunts and the exorcisms, the fear was raw and unfiltered. Locals avoided the cemetery at night, locking their doors and whispering of the evil that lurked within. Something had awoken in Highgate, something ancient and malevolent, and though it defied explanation, the growing list of witnesses could not be ignored. The Highgate Vampire was no longer just a story. It was real, a living nightmare that haunted the cemetery's shadowed paths and crumbling tombs. And as the sightings continued, so too did the terror. Highgate, once a place of mourning and memory, had become the stage for an unspeakable horror, one that refused to remain buried. The legend had only just begun. Chapter 2, Dark Shadows. By the early 1970s, the legend of the Highgate Vampire had become a force of its own, creeping into the fabric of London's public consciousness. What began as a few eerie sightings had snowballed into a full-blown supernatural hysteria. As the tall, shadowy figure lurking in Highgate Cemetery dominated headlines, fear spread through the city. The press fueled this frenzy, taking witness accounts and feeding them to an ever-curious and increasingly anxious public. Every new report of strange occurrences only fanned the flames. But behind the sensational stories were chilling testimonies from real people who believed they had encountered something unexplainable. Their words, laced with fear, added a layer of dread that no news article or media story could quite capture. Among the earliest and most unsettling claims were the reports of animal mutilations. Dead animals, mostly foxes and small mammals, were found near the cemetery, their bodies grotesquely torn apart. Some were discovered drained of blood, with no signs of how the injuries had been inflicted. Residents speculated that the vampire, if it truly existed, had been feasting on these unfortunate creatures, using them to sustain itself. Witnesses to these scenes described a profound sense of dread when approaching the mutilated bodies. One resident, recounting a walk through Swain's Lane near the cemetery, described stumbling upon a mutilated fox in 1970. Its eyes were wide open, staring right at me, and there wasn't a drop of blood anywhere near it, he said in an interview. I could feel something watching me. I didn't stay to find out what. Highgate Cemetery had always carried a certain foreboding presence, with its sprawling Victorian graves, crumbling mausoleums, and ivy-choked statues. But as more witnesses came forward with stories of the tall, cloaked figure, its atmosphere became something more sinister. It wasn't just eerie, it was oppressive. People began reporting a heavy, almost suffocating sensation when passing through the cemetery, as if an unseen force was pressing down on them. Those who dared to venture near after sunset spoke of feeling like they were being watched, the hairs on the back of their necks prickling with unseen menace. This growing sense of terror wasn't confined to the cemetery grounds. It spilled into the surrounding neighborhoods, and fear spread throughout North London. In response, the media seized upon the vampire narrative with vigor. Papers like the Hampstead and Highgate Express churned out articles detailing new sightings, each more dramatic than the last. One memorable headline read, "Vampire stalks Highgate, the shadow that feeds in the night." While some readers saw the stories as entertainment, others took the reports seriously, their imaginations stoked by the recurring descriptions of the glowing-eyed entity. As more reports of the vampire appeared in the news, visitors began flocking to the cemetery at night, hoping for a glimpse of the mysterious figure. What they found instead was often far more unsettling. Many who ventured into the cemetery came away with strange stories. The cemetery at night had taken on an entirely different character. Where once it had been a silent resting place, it now seemed alive with a dark, brooding energy. One witness, a local teenager named Peter Underwood, recalled an experience in early 1971 when he and a group of friends decided to explore Highgate at night. It was deathly quiet, but not peaceful. There was something in the air, like a tension that kept tightening the further we went in, he said. As they walked along one of the narrow paths, they noticed a flicker of movement among the gravestones, a shadow, shifting unnaturally fast. Then, in a clearing just ahead, they saw it, a tall, dark figure standing near a tomb, completely still but emanating a malevolent presence. It was as if the air around us turned to ice. We couldn't move. All I remember are its eyes, red, glowing in the dark, watching us. Then it was gone. We bolted out of there and never went back. Such first-hand accounts were not uncommon. Witnesses often described seeing a spectral figure with the same characteristics, tall, dark, and terrifying, with those piercing red eyes. Some claimed the figure had appeared from nowhere, moving with inhuman speed before disappearing again. What unnerved many was the consistency of the descriptions. Skeptics tried to rationalize these sightings, attributing them to mass hysteria, tricks of light, or the power of suggestion. But for those who had seen the figure, there was no doubt in their minds that something unnatural was lurking in the shadows of Highgate. As public fear grew, so too did the sense of mystery surrounding the cemetery. Day by day, more visitors arrived to witness the phenomenon for themselves, but not all would leave without experiencing something strange. Testimonies from locals living near the cemetery during this time spoke of eerie occurrences beyond just sightings of the figure. One woman, who lived in a house adjacent to Highgate, described a series of unsettling events that began with strange sounds outside her window at night, footsteps crunching on gravel, despite no one being there when she looked. It was like someone was walking outside, pacing back and forth, but every time I looked, there was nothing, she explained. Then one night I saw him, the tall figure standing just beyond the gate. He was looking right at me with those red eyes. I screamed, but he vanished before anyone else could see him. Local police were inundated with reports of trespassers in the cemetery at night. Groups of amateur vampire hunters, thrill seekers, and those hoping to catch a glimpse of the shadowy figure. Some vandalized graves, believing they were fighting off a demonic presence. As a result, authorities stepped up their patrols, though their presence did little to deter those drawn by the vampire legend. By this point, fear had escalated into a full-scale moral panic. Public fascination with the Highgate Vampire, spurred on by the media, reached fever pitch. Television crews arrived to document the strange happenings, and paranormal investigators began to claim that the cemetery was a hub of supernatural activity. The shadow of the vampire loomed large over London, its presence undeniable in the minds of those who believed. The more witnesses came forward, the more the legend grew. Even those who hadn't seen the vampire firsthand found themselves caught up in the hysteria. The power of the legend was not only in what had been seen, but in what people believed could be lurking in the shadows. Highgate Cemetery had become more than just a place of death. It was now a place of fear, where darkness seemed to hold sway. As the legend of the Highgate Vampire grew, so too did the sense that something was deeply wrong, not just in the cemetery, but in the city itself. The chilling testimonies, the mutilated animals, the cold dread that seemed to hang over everything. It all pointed to a darkness that refused to remain buried. The Highgate Vampire, whatever it was, had taken root in the public's imagination, casting a long shadow over North London that would not easily be shaken. Chapter 3. The Battle for the Vampire, Duel of the Occultists. By the early 1970s, the legend of the Highgate Vampire had reached fever pitch, drawing the attention of two men whose rivalry would become as infamous as the creature itself. David Farrant and Sean Manchester. Both claimed expertise in the occult and took it upon themselves to investigate the eerie happenings at Highgate Cemetery. However, their methods, beliefs, and motivations were as different as night and day, and soon their public feud became entangled with the mysterious vampire. David Farrant, a local man with a keen interest in the paranormal, was one of the first to publicly declare his intention to uncover the truth behind the Highgate Vampire. Tall and gaunt, with an almost spectral appearance himself, Farrant claimed to have experienced strange happenings in the cemetery. In 1969, he conducted a nighttime vigil within the grounds, hoping to confront whatever lurked there. According to his accounts, he felt a powerful, oppressive force while inside the cemetery, describing the sensation as if something was watching him. Farrant's claim to fame came when he spoke of seeing a shadowy figure lurking between the tombstones. He believed the presence to be supernatural, though not necessarily a vampire. Farrant suspected it could be a malevolent spirit or perhaps a demonic entity tied to the cemetery's dark energy. He delved into occult rituals, using protective charms and incantations in his attempt to ward off the creature. His encounters were well documented in interviews, where he described the palpable evil he felt radiating from certain graves. Sean Manchester, on the other hand, took a different approach. A self-proclaimed bishop in the mysterious British occult society, Manchester was a more flamboyant figure, often seen in priestly robes or performing dramatic rituals. In early 1970, he entered the fray by publicly declaring that the entity haunting Highgate Cemetery was, in fact, a vampire, a being of ancient evil that had taken up residence within the cemetery. He believed the creature to be a king vampire of Wallachian origin, brought to England by followers of black magic. Manchester's announcement sent ripples through the already terrified public. In his view, the vampire was not just an ethereal spirit, but a physical being that could be destroyed. He claimed that the vampire rested in one of the tombs by day, rising at night to feed on the blood of animals or humans. Manchester's colorful descriptions of the vampire's activities played into the Gothic narrative that had captured the public's imagination. The media, already hungry for sensational stories, latched onto his dramatic claims. Thus began the occultist rivalry. Farrant, with his more cautious approach, mocked Manchester's sensationalism, dismissing the idea of a vampire king as pure fantasy. Manchester, in turn, portrayed Farrant as an amateur dabbling in forces he couldn't possibly understand. Their clash soon became as much a part of the vampire legend as the creature itself, with newspapers gleefully covering every twist and turn of their feud. In February 1970, the tension came to a head. Manchester publicly declared that he would lead a vampire hunt in Highgate Cemetery on Friday, March 13th, an ominous date that only added to the spectacle. He and his followers, armed with crosses, wooden stakes, and garlic, prepared to storm the cemetery in the dead of night. The media swarmed to cover the event, and crowds gathered outside the cemetery gates, drawn by a mix of curiosity and fear. The public, already whipped into a frenzy by months of eerie stories, was eager to witness what would unfold. However, Farrant was not about to let Manchester steal the spotlight. Days before the planned vampire hunt, Farrant attempted his own vigil in the cemetery, claiming he was there to exorcise whatever malevolent forces had taken hold. According to Farrant, he was not seeking to kill the entity, but to understand and neutralize it using his knowledge of ancient rituals and protective spells. The night of the vampire hunt was a chaotic scene. Hundreds of onlookers gathered at the gates of Highgate Cemetery, hoping to see a showdown between the vampire hunters and the undead creature. The police were forced to intervene, concerned that the event would spiral out of control. Manchester, undeterred, led a small group of his followers into the cemetery, determined to find the vampire's lair. According to Manchester's account, the group searched the cemetery for hours, combing through the overgrown tombs and crypts. He later claimed that they found an old vault sealed with iron gates, which he believed contained the vampire's resting place. In his dramatic retelling, Manchester asserted that the group attempted to break into the vault, but were thwarted by unseen forces before they could complete their mission. Farrant, meanwhile, ridiculed Manchester's attempts as little more than theater. He maintained that the vampire was not a physical entity, but a spirit, and that Manchester's methods were ineffective against the true nature of the evil within the cemetery. Farrant's own investigations, often solitary and conducted in the dead of night, were far more subtle. He continued to perform rituals in and around Highgate, claiming that he had witnessed the shadowy figure on multiple occasions, always accompanied by an overwhelming sense of dread. Despite their differences, both Farrant and Manchester attracted loyal followers. Farrant's supporters admired his calm and methodical approach, believing that he was the only one truly capable of understanding the paranormal forces at work. Manchester's followers, on the other hand, reveled in the theatrical nature of his vampire hunts, eager to believe in the physical reality of the creature. Interviews with supporters of both men highlight the growing divide in public opinion. Some viewed Farrant as the true investigator, an expert in the occult who was taking a measured and respectful approach to the supernatural. Others dismissed him as a charlatan, believing that Manchester's dramatic exorcisms and vampire hunts were the only way to confront the dark forces plaguing Highgate Cemetery. Detractors of both men, however, saw the entire affair as little more than a media-fueled spectacle. Local authorities, faced with increasing vandalism in the cemetery, condemned the hunts as dangerous and irresponsible. Grave robbers and thrill-seekers began to desecrate tombs, fueled by the belief that a vampire lay within the grounds. The cemetery, once a place of mourning and respect, had become a battleground for occultists and a playground for the curious. As the rivalry between Farrant and Manchester escalated, so too did the strange happenings at Highgate. Reports of the vampire sightings continued, with some claiming to have seen the figure wandering not just the cemetery, but the surrounding streets. Animals continued to be found mutilated, their bodies drained of blood. The media circus showed no signs of slowing, with each new claim from Farrant or Manchester adding to the legend. The battle for the vampire's soul had begun. But as Farrant and Manchester's rivalry deepened, the true nature of the entity haunting Highgate remained as elusive as ever, lurking in the shadows of a cemetery that had become a theater for both the living and the dead. Chapter 4: Midnight Hunts. The night at Highgate Cemetery was still, a thick blanket of fog wrapping the ancient tombs in an eerie silence. But within the shadows, strange figures moved between the graves, guided by the flicker of candlelight and the obsessive search for the supernatural. By the early 1970s, the Highgate Vampire legend had transformed from mere rumor into a full-blown obsession, drawing all manner of believers, occultists, and thrill-seekers into its gothic embrace. What started as a few whispered sightings had erupted into a series of midnight hunts. By night, the cemetery became a magnet for self-proclaimed vampire hunters, eager to track down and destroy the creature that had captured London's imagination. The atmosphere was charged with fear and curiosity, and as the legend spread, so too did the hysteria. One of the earliest vampire hunts was ignited by Sean Manchester's dramatic declaration that he would lead a group of hunters into the heart of Highgate to find and destroy the vampire. Armed with wooden stakes, crucifixes, and garlic, Manchester's group ventured into the cemetery on March 13, 1970. Hundreds of onlookers gathered outside the cemetery gates, drawn by newspaper headlines that promised the ultimate showdown between good and evil. Local police, already frustrated with the attention the cemetery was receiving, were forced to stand guard, ready to arrest trespassers or defuse the inevitable chaos. Eyewitnesses from that night describe a surreal scene. Amid the haunting gravestones, Groups of men and women crept through the overgrown paths, clutching holy relics and whispering prayers. One witness, a man who had followed Manchester and his group, claimed the tension was palpable. You could feel it in the air, he later recounted. It was as though the cemetery itself was alive with something dark, something waiting. Despite the theatrics, no vampire was found that night. But that didn't stop the hunters. As the weeks passed, more groups flocked to Highgate Cemetery in the dead of night, determined to track down the elusive creature. Many had read about the sightings in newspapers or heard about the hunts through whispers in pubs. Some were true believers, convinced that the vampire was real and that it needed to be stopped before it could strike again. Others were merely curious onlookers, seeking a thrill in the shadowy landscape of the old cemetery. Police testimony from this period paints a picture of growing chaos. Sergeant Patterson, a local officer who frequently patrolled the cemetery grounds, described the challenges of dealing with the influx of hunters and trespassers. We would find people wandering the cemetery at all hours of the night, he said. They were convinced there was something in there, and it wasn't just kids looking for a scare. Some of these people were serious. In one police report from late 1970, officers discovered a group of hunters gathered around a freshly opened tomb. The stone slab had been removed, and the coffin inside had been disturbed, its lid cracked open. It was clear they were looking for the vampire, the report stated. They had brought stakes with them, and some were in a state of hysteria, claiming to have heard strange noises from inside the crypt. Such incidents were not isolated. Multiple graves in Highgate Cemetery were vandalized during this period, with headstones knocked over and coffins tampered with. Police had to chase groups of hunters out of the cemetery on several occasions, but the hunts persisted, fueled by a growing sense of hysteria. People believed that the vampire was hiding in one of the crypts, waiting for nightfall to emerge and feed. Many of those who ventured into the cemetery reported unsettling experiences. One such witness, a woman named Christine, described visiting Highgate with a group of friends late one evening in 1971. They had brought along cameras, hoping to capture proof of the supernatural. As they wandered deeper into the cemetery, Christine recalled a sudden drop in temperature. It was freezing, and there was this heavy feeling like the air was thick, she said in a later interview. And then, out of nowhere, we saw this shadow move across the path in front of us. It wasn't a person. It was like a black mist, and it disappeared behind one of the tombs. Another account came from a young man named Peter, who had been part of a group that ventured into Highgate in early 1972. He described an oppressive atmosphere and the feeling that they were being watched. There was this old mausoleum we passed, Peter recalled, and just as we were about to walk by, the door creaked open by itself. None of us went near it after that. Stranger still were the accounts of animal mutilations. Throughout the early 1970s, locals began to report finding the bodies of foxes and other small animals near the cemetery, their throats slashed and their blood drained. These gruesome discoveries only added to the growing belief that the Highgate vampire was real and that it was feeding on the local wildlife. Witnesses described the scenes as macabre, with some hunters insisting that these were the vampire's victims, drained before it moved on to humans. Meanwhile, the media fanned the flames of the hysteria, with headlines screaming of vampire hunts and occult rituals. News outlets ran sensational stories of mysterious figures seen wandering the cemetery at night, strange lights flickering between the tombstones, and unexplained noises echoing through the grounds. The line between reality and legend began to blur, and each new report seemed to invite more midnight hunts. One of the most chilling testimonies came from a man named Alan, who visited the cemetery with a friend in late 1972. He described how, as they approached one of the larger mausoleums, they heard a low, guttural growl coming from within. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, Alan said. It was deep, almost like an animal, but it had this horrible human quality to it. We ran, and we didn't look back. Despite the continued hunts, no physical evidence of the vampire was ever uncovered. But strange phenomena continued to occur, deepening the mystery. Some claimed to see glowing red eyes watching from the trees, while others reported sudden gusts of icy wind, even on warm nights. One witness, a local man named Robert, described hearing footsteps behind him as he made his way through the cemetery, only to turn around and find no one there. It was as though something was following me, he said. I don't believe in vampires, but there was something in that place. As the 1970s wore on, the vampire hunts began to wane, but the damage had been done. Highgate Cemetery, once a quiet resting place for the dead, had become a battleground for the living. Graves had been desecrated, and the cemetery's reputation was forever altered. Yet, despite the chaos, the legend of the Highgate Vampire endured, leaving behind a chilling reminder of how deeply fear can take root when darkness falls. Chapter 5: A Vampire in the Headlines. The quiet murmur of London's Highgate Cemetery was shattered in the early 1970s by the screams of media headlines and the whispered terror of its inhabitants. As the vampire legend took hold, it wasn't just the dark, moss-covered tombs or the gnarled trees casting eerie shadows that fed the fear. It was the newspapers and television screens that turned a local tale into an international phenomenon. What had begun as eerie sightings and a few strange encounters quickly spiraled into full-blown hysteria, and at the center of it all was the media's voracious appetite for the sensational. In February 1970, the local press reported the first accounts of an unsettling presence within the cemetery walls. A handful of witnesses, their faces pale with fear, spoke of a tall, shadowy figure with glowing eyes drifting through the tombstones. These initial reports were enough to spark curiosity, but as the legend grew, so did the scope of the media's attention. Newspapers from across the country, desperate for a story that would grip their readers, descended on Highgate. The Hampstead and Highgate Express, the first to report the sightings, published several articles detailing the accounts of locals who had witnessed strange happenings in and around the cemetery. One particularly gripping headline read, "Does a vampire walk in Highgate?" The article beneath described a phantom figure seen by multiple witnesses, its eyes gleaming in the moonlight as it moved silently through the graves. Readers were transfixed, their imaginations stirred by these accounts of a lurking, predatory presence. The press quickly seized upon the imagery of the vampire, a creature steeped in folklore and fear, and began crafting a narrative that would soon spread like wildfire. The cemetery became a hot spot for journalists, many of whom were more than willing to embellish the accounts to captivate an audience hungry for horror. One reporter, Michael Carter of the London Evening News, recalled his first visit to the cemetery in the spring of 1970, saying there was an undeniable eeriness about the place at night. The shadows seemed to twist and coil in unnatural ways, and even though I knew I was alone, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. Carter's reports, which sensationalized the vampire angle, contributed to a growing sense of unease among London's residents. Headlines such as "Vampire Panic Grips Highgate" and "Graves Disturbed by Vampire Hunters" fueled the public's imagination. Soon, it wasn't just the locals who were drawn to Highgate Cemetery, but thrill-seekers from across the country, each hoping to catch a glimpse of the supernatural. Sean Manchester, a figure who would become synonymous with the Highgate Vampire saga, found himself at the center of this media storm. Manchester's declaration that he would lead a vampire hunt within the cemetery made him a media darling. He was frequently interviewed on television and radio, his serious demeanor and claims of occult expertise lending an air of credibility to the story. He spoke of rituals, dark forces, and the need to vanquish the vampire before it could claim more victims. "This is no mere ghost," Manchester warned in a 1970 television interview. "This is an ancient evil, one that has fed on the living for centuries." Manchester's bold claims caught the attention of the international press, and soon his name and the legend of the Highgate Vampire were making headlines far beyond London. Foreign newspapers, from Europe to America, ran stories about the vampire terror in the heart of one of England's oldest cemeteries. The cemetery, once a place of solemn reflection, was now a battleground in the war between good and evil, at least in the minds of those who devoured these reports. David Farrant, a rival of Manchester's and another key figure in the vampire saga, also found himself embroiled in the media frenzy. Farrant's approach was more skeptical, though no less dramatic. He believed in the supernatural, but was wary of the exaggerated claims surrounding the vampire. In interviews with newspapers such as The Sun and the Daily Express, Farrant spoke of the rituals he had conducted in the cemetery and the strange phenomena he had witnessed. "I don't believe it's a vampire in the traditional sense," he said in one interview, "but there's definitely something dark at work in Highgate." Both men, with their opposing views and frequent media appearances, became almost as infamous as the vampire itself. Their rivalry was played out in the headlines, with Manchester portraying himself as the heroic vampire slayer and Farrant as the more measured investigator. The press eagerly pounced on this narrative, framing the story as not only a supernatural mystery, but also a personal duel between two men obsessed with the occult. As the media attention grew, so too did the public's fascination. Soon, Highgate Cemetery was overrun with visitors, many of whom came not to mourn the dead, but to witness the vampire for themselves. The cemetery became a hotspot for amateur vampire hunters, some of whom brought stakes, crucifixes, and garlic in hopes of confronting the creature. These nocturnal visitors left behind a trail of vandalism and destruction. Tombs were broken into, graves desecrated, and statues toppled, all in the name of vampire hunting. One local resident, Mrs. Judith Langley, lived near the cemetery and recalled the strange crowds that gathered nightly outside the gates. "It was like a circus," she said in an interview with the Hampstead and Highgate Express. "They would come in droves, especially after dark. You could hear them whispering and giggling, but there was always this underlying fear. Everyone seemed to believe that something terrible was hiding in the cemetery." Despite the growing panic, there was never any solid evidence that a vampire, or any other supernatural entity, was actually haunting Highgate. Nevertheless, the power of the media was undeniable. The press had taken what might have been a minor local mystery and transformed it into a sensation, one that captivated the public and left a lasting mark on London's history. Journalist accounts from the time reflect the mixed feelings of those who had covered the story. Many admitted that the tale had been sensationalized, but they also acknowledged the strange atmosphere surrounding Highgate Cemetery. As one reporter, Graham O'Neill, wrote in a 1971 editorial, "The story of the Highgate vampire was born out of fear and darkness, but once it was unleashed, it took on a life of its own. Whether or not a vampire ever truly stalked those graves, one thing is certain: the terror it inspired was very real." By the time the media frenzy began to subside in the mid-1970s, Highgate Cemetery had become a legend in its own right. The stories of the vampire, fueled by sensational headlines and public panic, left a legacy that would endure for decades. Chapter 6: The Vampire Exorcism. As the hysteria surrounding the Highgate vampire reached its fever pitch, all eyes turned to Sean Manchester, the self-proclaimed vampire hunter who promised to rid London of its undead menace. By 1971, Manchester had not only fueled the public's fear of the lurking vampire, but also positioned himself as the hero who would confront it head-on. His claims of occult knowledge, combined with a flair for the dramatic, culminated in one of the most infamous events in London's supernatural history, the vampire exorcism. In a public declaration, Manchester announced that he had tracked the Highgate vampire to its lair and would soon conduct an exorcism to end the creature's reign of terror. It was a bold claim that immediately attracted attention from both the press and local onlookers. According to Manchester, the vampire had nested within a particular tomb in the cemetery, hidden among the crumbling graves and Gothic crypts. He described the creature as a king vampire, an ancient entity that had risen from the grave to terrorize the living. The night of the exorcism was shrouded in secrecy, yet several witnesses claimed to have seen strange happenings that confirmed their belief in Manchester's story. Those who gathered near Highgate Cemetery on that fateful night recounted an atmosphere of palpable dread. The cold air, heavy with mist, seemed to carry whispers through the trees, and the moon cast an eerie glow over the crumbling headstones. Peter Hudson, a young journalist at the time, later described the scene. "I remember standing outside the cemetery gates, watching the shadows move. There were maybe a dozen people with me, all waiting, expecting something terrible to happen. We knew Manchester was inside, and we were all on edge, It felt like the world held its breath. According to Manchester's own accounts, he and a small group of trusted followers ventured into the cemetery under the cover of darkness, armed with the tools of a vampire slayer: wooden stakes, crucifixes, and holy water. In his book, The Highgate Vampire, Manchester described what transpired that night in vivid detail. He claimed that they found the vampire's resting place within an old, dilapidated crypt. As they entered, a stifling sense of malevolence enveloped the group, and the air grew thick with the foul stench of decay. In Manchester's telling, the vampire lay dormant within a coffin, its body unnaturally preserved and its skin deathly pale. He described the creature's eyes as closed, but the overwhelming sensation of evil radiating from its body left no doubt in his mind that it was the vampire that had been terrorizing Highgate for years. The ritual began with prayers of exorcism, followed by the raising of the wooden stake. Manchester claimed that as he plunged the stake into the vampire's heart, the creature's body convulsed violently, and an unearthly scream echoed through the crypt. Witnesses outside the cemetery reported hearing strange noises that night, disturbing sounds that lingered in their memories long after. One bystander, Margaret Jones, recounted the chilling experience. "I was standing by the gate when I heard it, a scream, but not a human one. It was high-pitched and terrible, like something from a nightmare. Everyone froze. We all heard it." Though Manchester declared victory over the Highgate Vampire, controversy soon followed. David Farrant, Manchester's rival and fellow occultist, quickly denounced the exorcism as a sham. Farrant, who had been conducting his own investigations, claimed that Manchester's theatrics were nothing more than a publicity stunt designed to exploit the media frenzy. Farrant maintained that no genuine vampire existed in Highgate, and that the disturbances were likely caused by other supernatural forces or mass hysteria. Despite Farrant's skepticism, Manchester supporters were steadfast in their belief. Some even claimed to have witnessed the immediate aftermath of the exorcism, where Manchester purportedly burned the vampire's remains, ensuring that it would never rise again. These claims, however, were met with widespread doubt, as no verifiable evidence of a vampire's body or bones was ever produced. The lack of concrete proof did little to dissuade Manchester's followers, who believed his word was enough. Throughout the 1970s, the rivalry between Manchester and Farrant grew more intense. Farrant continued his nocturnal visits to the cemetery, conducting his own rituals and gathering testimonies from those who believed they had encountered supernatural entities in the area. While he denied the existence of a literal vampire, Farrant claimed that dark forces still haunted Highgate. He insisted that Manchester's exorcism had been a failure, and that the cemetery remained a hotbed of paranormal activity. By this time, Highgate Cemetery had become infamous not only for the vampire, but also for the damage caused by midnight hunters, thrill seekers, and occultists. The once quiet cemetery had become a battleground of conflicting ideologies, with Manchester and Farrant at the forefront. Their disputes often played out in the media, with each accusing the other of fraud and deception. The public, meanwhile, remained divided, with some clinging to the belief in the vampire's demise and others convinced that the nightmare was far from over. As the years passed, the media's attention began to wane, but the mystery of the Highgate Vampire remained unresolved. While Manchester claimed to have banished the creature once and for all, there were still occasional reports of strange happenings in the cemetery, ghostly figures, inexplicable cold spots, and the same oppressive atmosphere that had first drawn attention to the site. One final testimony came from a local resident who preferred to remain anonymous. In a 1979 interview with the Hampstead and Highgate Express, she described a chilling encounter. "I was walking by the cemetery at dusk when I saw something moving near the tombs. At first, I thought it was a shadow, but then I realized it was too tall, too solid. It just stood there, watching me. I don't know what it was, but I'll never forget those eyes. They glowed in the dark." This testimony, though one of the last public accounts, served as a reminder that for many, the mystery of the Highgate Vampire was far from over. Whether Sean Manchester truly exorcised an ancient evil or simply fueled a wave of supernatural hysteria, the legend had taken on a life of its own, forever entwining Highgate Cemetery with the haunting specter of a vampire. As the media moved on, the Highgate Vampire became a ghost story of the modern era, a tale that left behind more questions than answers. But for those who had lived through the hunts, the rituals, and the eerie nights spent within the cemetery's shadowy walls, the fear remained. The vampire, real or imagined, had left its mark on London, a chilling reminder of the power of belief and the darkness that sometimes lurks just beyond the grave. Chapter 7: Legacy of the Highgate Vampire. Myth, Mystery, and Modern Perspectives. The legend of the Highgate Vampire is one that refuses to die, its shadow lingering over London for more than half a century. As time passed, what began as an eerie series of sightings in a Gothic cemetery spiraled into one of the most infamous paranormal cases in British history. Today, the story is woven into the fabric of London folklore, its mysteries still debated by historians, paranormal investigators, and those who lived through the bizarre events of the 1970s. The Highgate Vampire has transcended its origins, becoming a symbol of the strange, the supernatural, and the unexplained. Highgate Cemetery, established in 1839, was already a place of mystique long before the vampire rumors began. Its sprawling grounds, filled with ancient crypts, elaborate tombstones, and towering trees, made it the perfect setting for a ghost story. Over time, the cemetery fell into disrepair, its decaying architecture adding to its eerie atmosphere. For decades, the tales of strange occurrences in Highgate whispered through local pubs and streets, but it was not until the late 1960s that these stories took on a darker, more terrifying twist. The legacy of the Highgate Vampire is a complicated one. On one hand, it is a story steeped in supernatural intrigue, a tale of a centuries-old vampire stalking the shadows of a London cemetery. On the other, it is a reflection of the societal anxieties and media-fueled hysteria of the time. In the 1970s, the vampire story provided an outlet for the public's fascination with the occult, which had surged in the wake of cultural shifts and rising interest in the paranormal. Modern-day perspectives vary widely. For some, the Highgate Vampire remains an unsolved mystery. Paranormal investigators and enthusiasts continue to explore the cemetery, hoping to catch a glimpse of the tall, shadowy figure that supposedly once roamed its grounds. One such investigator, Paul Adams, recounts his experiences in Highgate as part of his research into the case. There's a palpable energy in the cemetery, especially near the western catacombs. I've visited countless times, and every time I feel like I'm being watched. Whether it's a spirit, a vampire, or something else, I can't say, but the place is alive with the paranormal. Adams is not alone in his belief. To this day, Highgate Cemetery draws in those intrigued by its ghostly history. Night tours of the grounds often include nods to the vampire legend, and many visitors report feeling an overwhelming sense of unease while walking through the cemetery. Cold spots, strange noises, and fleeting apparitions continue to be reported, keeping the myth alive for the next generation of thrill seekers. But while the paranormal community continues to explore the possibility of a supernatural presence, historians offer a more grounded explanation. Simon Bradley, a historian specializing in Victorian London, suggests that the Highgate Vampire phenomenon was the product of mass hysteria and media sensationalism. The timing of these events is key, Bradley explains. The late 1960s and early 1970s saw a rise in interest in the occult, particularly with the release of films like Dracula and The Exorcist. People were primed to believe in dark, supernatural forces, and Highgate Cemetery, with its Gothic architecture and history of death, became the perfect backdrop for these fears. Bradley also points to the rivalry between Sean Manchester and David Farrant as a contributing factor to the frenzy. Their public feud over the existence and nature of the vampire, coupled with media attention, turned the story into a sensation. What we see here, Bradley continues, is a classic case of myth-making. You have two charismatic figures feeding off each other's claims, a media eager for a sensational headline, and a public ready to believe. It's no surprise that the vampire legend took hold in the way it did. Despite the skepticism of historians, Those who lived through the events often describe them in a way that suggests something strange was indeed happening in Highgate. Local resident and Saunders recalls the atmosphere in the area during the height of the vampire hunts. It was like the whole neighborhood was under a spell. People were scared to walk by the cemetery at night. I remember the police patrolling the area, and there was always a group of people hanging around the gates, waiting for something to happen. Even if you didn't believe in the vampire, you could feel that something wasn't right. For Saunders and many others, the Highgate Vampire became more than just a story. It became a part of the local identity. The cemetery itself, once a resting place for London's elite, became a focal point for paranormal activity and urban legend. And while the vampire sightings eventually faded from the headlines, the impact on the cemetery was long-lasting. Highgate became a symbol of mystery and death, its overgrown pathways and decaying monuments serving as a constant reminder of the strange events that had unfolded there. Today, Highgate Cemetery is a place where history and legend intertwine. The Friends of Highgate Cemetery Trust, which now manages the site, has restored much of its original beauty, but the eerie atmosphere remains. Guided tours through the cemetery often touch on the vampire legend, and visitors are reminded that the grounds hold more than just the bones of the dead. They hold stories, fears, and mysteries that may never be fully understood. In reflecting on the legacy of the Highgate Vampire, it becomes clear that the truth of the matter is less important than the lasting effect the story has had on both the cemetery and those who hear it. Whether a real vampire stalked the grounds in the 1970s, or whether it was a case of mass hysteria and occult theater, the legend has become a permanent part of London's supernatural lore. As one final testimony from a visitor in the early 2000s suggests, the mystery continues to haunt. I went to Highgate out of curiosity, just to see the famous cemetery. But once I was there, walking among the graves, I felt it, this weight, this presence. I don't know if it was a vampire, but I know I wasn't alone. The Highgate Vampire, myth or reality, continues to cast its long shadow. It stands as a reminder that some stories, once they take hold, are not so easily laid to rest. The chilling legend of the Highgate Vampire lives on, and now you've experienced its eerie tale firsthand. Do you believe the vampire truly stalked the cemetery grounds? Or is it a story born of fear and fascination? Your perspective matters. Share your thoughts, your theories, or even your own experiences. Spread the mystery with others and join the conversation.